What's up, Come Up family? My name is Mark, and this is Language Come Up, a place where I come up, and you do too. Today I have a guest with me. I'm very excited about it. Marco, Camilo, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing excellent. I'm very excited to talk with you. I've enjoyed your tweets for quite some time, and I told myself the day will come when I'll finally get to talk to Marco, and look, that day is just right now.
It's arrived. Likewise, man. I've always wanted to meet you, so I'm just glad to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure. So, the first thing I would really like to know is how did this language journey begin for you? I find people's language journeys quite fascinating, their story. Why don't you talk to me a little bit about your story and how you got involved in this whole world of languages and language learning?
Yeah, sure. So the first time I had contact with like a foreign language, I was 4 years old. I was so hyperactive as a child that my parents tried to find every single activity they can sign me up for, and uh, just free up some energy so that when I come back home, I could just go straight to bed. And one of those activities was actually taking French. Uh,
Oh,
and I really loved it. So I started back in the Alliance Française back in Puerto Rico. And that's how I started my journey. Basically, I took French ab und zu, as saying German. I got my German, like all over the place in my head. So
it
um,
happens.
I'll try to, keep it separate as much as possible. But now and then I kept, just taking French in the Alliance when I was 4, then when I was 6, when I was 8, when I was 12. And then when I was 14, in that stage, discovering your own identity and stuff, I reflected a little bit on my heritage and I wanted to start learning Italian.
Oh,
Yeah. Recently, I tweeted about kind of my choice of learning Italian because of my heritage. My parents
mm-hmm.
from Corsica, and so since it's a language from the same dialect family, I decided to continue with Italian, and I just kept going on until I got to university and I took my first Russian class. Um, Basically, I've always seen, Russian written in movies and stuff, and I felt offended I couldn't understand because it was like, I know it's an alphabet, like, it's not Chinese, for example, or a syllabary or such. Um, but I knew it was an alphabet. I know those were words, but I felt kind of offended I couldn't understand. So I wanted to take up the challenge and see what's, decipher the message. And I just fell in love with the pronunciation, the musicality of the language, and I decided to study Russian for as for my career, and here I am.
Uh-huh. Wonderful. And that was your major. It was Slavic studies or Slavic language studies, or it was just Russian,
Actually, my bachelor's was in modern languages,
modern
two languages,
languages.
German and French. Where does Russian come in all of this? Our university doesn't offer Russian as a major, so the close I had to do kind of I don't know, like a layover a degree, so to say. And the closest thing I could study closest to Russia would be was German. And so I looked up some programs to study Russian, graduate school, and Germany was the next to best thing outside of the states. So yeah, I took German as a first language so I can prepare to come here and study. And so yeah,
Wonderful. And I understand that was an interesting experience as well.
a really good experience. It's a dream come true, like literally. And I know it might sound cliche, but truly, it's a dream come true being here. So
Well, it's always wonderful to realize when those situations are really happening. You don't want to notice things once they've already passed. It's nice to live the moment and realize that you're living a special moment.
definitely.
Wonderful. So the first question is, so actually I have so much I want to talk to you about that I'm not sure I'm going to take many questions until like towards the end, but this one is actually kind of relevant. So uh where's Marco from? So why don't you answer that?
So I'm originally from New York, back in the States. And but my parents are Puerto Rican. So when I was 3, they decided to move back to Puerto Rico for family reasons. Be back closer to family. But I always kept going back and forth between Puerto Rico and New York, and so kind of the reason I still have kind of my accent despite all the time I've been living in Puerto Rico. So
You do, you do. That's cool.
yeah. So
uh,
I'm a New Yorker. Well, precisely a New Yorican, as we call her. It's also
right. So you mentioned how you learned Italian, but it's kind of sort of like the dialect of the heritage of your family. Was that true?
yeah. Yeah, so my family comes from Corsica. My second last name, like I'm from Latin American culture, so we use two last names. So my name's Marco Andres Camilo Pietri, and that Pietri part, well, it's a Corsican last name, and it's a small island. I don't know how many of you guys know where's Corsica. It's a small island next to Italy. Italy has like two islands right next to each other, besides Sicily, and it's the smallest top one. So that's Corsica. There's a lot of immigrants in Puerto Rico came from there, and so they speak Corsican actually, like their own language. But there aren't not many learning resources for Corsican. So the nearest I could learn was Italian, and so I decided to learn Italian so that I can at some point in my life jump into Corsican, and was really helpful. Like since it's a dialect continuum, even though Corsican is its own language, it's really similar to Italian. So,
Mm-hmm.
and the closest dialects are the ones in the south of Italy. And so, yeah, I decided to, just go with those instead of the standard. So,
Wonderful. And that's quite interesting because I think I read something that you said about the benefits of actually choosing a specific dialect of the language. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? What do you think? What do you see as some of the benefits of doing that, as opposed to maybe just starting with something kind of more regular, so to speak?
yeah. So I think that when you start, especially when you start with a language that has a lot of dialects. So, for example, taking Spanish as a perfect example, like it's one of the language with the most dialects, I would say. Um, Checking out the different dialects and what their differences are before studying, it makes you study a language more intentionally and a little bit more connected to the culture. So in my case, I started to look up what are the different dialects in Italy and what are the differences and such. And surprisingly, the ones in the south are are closer to Spanish in terms of pronunciation,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the vowel system is a little bit more simple also. Um, and culturally, they're a little bit more, they're a little bit warmer than the ones the Italians from the north. So I was really drawn into the culture since just simply because of those things. And since it's closer to Corsican as a language, I said if my intention is to study Corsican through Italian, that would be a good transition. And the other reason is because simply I love the culture from the south. Like there are so many similarities between Latin American culture and the southern part of Italy that
Oh,
just really easy to relate and to connect with them, and it's maybe one of the reasons it came so naturally at the start. So yeah, I would say that choosing a dialect instead of just going straight to the standard makes you more sensitive to cultural differences. In Spanish, you have that same problem of two standards that are taught worldwide. You have European Spanish, or you have Latin American Spanish, which is basically the Mexican variant that's
mm-hmm.
popularized. And so there are really big differences between those two. So
Sure.
choosing your dialect, it might be first of all easier for you when you're starting a language, and second of all, it makes you a little bit more sensitive to all the different dialects and richness that a dialect can bring.
Right. I mean, I'm just in love with Spanish due to the fact of how diverse the language is and through the different dialects. Here in Mexico City, as you can imagine, it's like a hub of all Latin American people. So I've come in contact with Venezuelans, Colombians, Cubans. I mean, you name it. Not so, not really any Puerto Ricans. I have to say that though. So I want to ask you about that. But it's really interesting to see how just they use the language in terms of grammatical variation or word stress variation, or just some kind of words that are
Yeah,
quite different, like this sos or vos or things like that versus tu or usted. That's quite
yeah.
interesting. What are some interesting functions of Puerto Rican Spanish that you could comment on?
So our dialect belongs to the Caribbean
Uh-huh.
area of dialects. So Venezuelans, especially Venezuelans, Dominicans, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans are all part of the same, so it's a dialect group. Panama, to some extent, it's also in that area. So especially from the Caribbean per se, like not so much Venezuela, but particularly from the Caribbean, one of the features is that we shorten a lot words. I say we're one of the most efficient dialects. I always love to say that from like a descriptivist point of view, because we speak really fast. Like we get our message across in a very effective amount of time. We typically don't pronounce a lot of the S's at the ends of words. So that, saves a lot of time.
I've noticed.
Yes. Another thing is the R's. Some R's, we don't pronounce them as R's, but as L's. So that makes it a little bit more easier. A lot of people have the impression that, for example, Puerto Ricans, they don't pronounce the R's and they imitate our name, for example, our country's name as Puerto Rico. And it sounds more, and that really sounds as most Asian immigrants would say it in Puerto Rico. But we actually say Puerto Rico. So the first one we say it as an L, the second one as a normal R. So it really depends on the position on how you would pronounce it, right? But that's one of the two most known examples. The R, we sometimes pronounce it as an L to make it more easier or more relaxed. And a lot of S's at the ends of words before consonants, we don't pronounce them as such. So.
Okay, and what about in terms of vocabulary? Is it very specific to Puerto Rico?
Every country. Let me tell you even more. Spanish has such high dialectal variety that even in our small island, we have like 5 dialects. And dialects doesn't necessarily have to differentiate themselves by pronunciation, although it does happen even in our island, but also in vocabulary. So, for example, we have a lot of English words or loan words because of our political relationship with the U.S. And therefore, for example, especially younger generations, we wouldn't say estacionarse, like to park oneself. We would say parquearse.
They say that in like things like that in the north of Mexico, like near Tijuana. That's on the border of Mexico. They have these kind of anglicismos, these kind of English words.
We also have, for example, to hang out, hanguear. That's another word.
I learned that from Bad Bunny, actually.
Yeah. We have a lot of English loan words, but we also have our own particular Puerto Rican words, which are, like descendants from our mixed culture, both Spanish culture, Indian culture, and African culture, which are basically mixed in our beautiful melting pot. We have, for example, avocado, of course, aguacate, but for example, bembe, for example, that's like an African descendant word. It's for example, when there's like a party or there's something active going on, like there's a bembe going on here, right? Or for example, meollo, for example, for a mixture, or not mixture, but for example, a really complicated problem, or when someone has a lot of thoughts in their minds, or they can't explain things correctly, we say you have a meollo in your mind, for example. So things like that. So it's pretty fun, especially, but it's also difficult when you go out into other Spanish-speaking countries, like adjusting your own dialect to a kind of false standard. Difficult things for every Spanish speaker that goes out.
I gotcha. And okay, just to get started with some more technical things, you mentioned that learning a language by yourself doesn't equal knowing how to learn a language by yourself. So you said you should follow people, ask them questions, improve your methods. All right. So some people would say just start the language and things will work out, just continue. I don't know if what you're saying here is kind of already kind of study how to study language before you study language. And if so, is that what you're saying? And would you recommend that?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've noticed a lot in language learning Twitter is people start learning languages through a motivation of just starting heads on with the language. And it's really beautiful at first when you start just because of a really honest passion for language. But a lot of people then end up studying with methods or with strategies that aren't really working for them, or then aren't really productive for them. And then at the end, one of the most kind of not stressful parts, but one of the most sad parts I see at the end is then people tweeting, for example, their burnout, or tweeting that they're stuck in their own level, or they're not progressing and they're not enjoying their experience. And that's kind of a sad part that comes because of not necessarily knowing how to learn. Like on my experience, I learned that the hard way, actually with Italian at start. When I started learning Italian, I remember I was at Costco with my parents and I asked them to, there's this 2 CD set with for just learning basic Italian, and they gifted it to me, and I started, just listening to those CDs. For it was a computer program, so you can click on images and just see their the Italian phrase or Italian word and the pronunciation, then the translation, and that was really helpful. And then from there, I knew that I needed somehow to understand that immersion, so to say, or that audio content in some way that I could just create my phrases. So as a natural, not kid learner, I started to look at a grammar, and I went on a grammar spree, and I started just drilling in every rule there was about Italian grammar. And I had like if I were in Twitter in studied Twitter by that point, I would have been like a pure example. I had my own notebook with all colors, with these tables, beautiful organization. It didn't work. Because I wasn't balancing my methods. I wasn't balancing the different skills that are needed to master a language. And I see a lot of that happening, and for many people who start with a really honest motivation for learning languages. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about is helping people to prevent burnout and actually enjoy the process, but actually helping them achieve the goal of, after all, mastering a language or achieving a better proficiency. So I had to learn, even through my own experience, that even though I wanted to self-study a language, I never studied pedagogy. I never studied language didactics. And that was something that I could, once I started going into that, I gained so much insight into how to learn things better according to how our brains work, according to how language acquisition works. And so I just always suggest people to, in parallel to studying and starting a language, if you're completely new to language learning, follow people, ask questions. If you, as soon as you encounter a difficulty or any hurdle, just ask someone and start learning by what other people do. And above all, putting into context what they're doing and how effective or efficient those methods are. So I always do that because I would have wished to have that in mind as I started out. And I think that's really helpful for, especially when you do not know how language learning works, or you're just learning your first foreign language.
Interesting. Yeah, for sure. And I've been kind of following the language learning community for some period of time, since about 2014, when I started getting interested in languages. And you can kind of see kind of a transition in thought, throughout the years, maybe even before that time when I got in there, the whole kind of like speak in 3 months thing was like kind of like this debate between, Benny Lewis and Steve Kaufman, and they were kind of talking the differences about that. And, in the last couple of years, it's always been about immersion. And you've talked about maybe your doubts towards this immersion idea of just like throwing yourself in there and just like immersing, so to speak. Reading your tweets, it seems like you're a bit kind of weary of it, and me to an extent as well. Why don't you talk a little bit about your thoughts on this whole idea of language through immersion?
Yeah. So I tend to be countercultural, at least in stuff that I think I can somehow bring balance to. And most of my tweets are precisely to put into question things that aren't necessarily being questioned. And I would say that my posture regarding immersion is always against exclusively using immersion to learn a language, simply because of the fact that we're already adults. Adults, of course, if you're an adolescent, a teenager, I'm still considering you as an adult in the sense that you already have a native language. And that is something that differentiates a lot of the theoretical basis of exclusively learning by immersion versus explicitly learning a language. And to explain the difference,
Please.
This concept or this idea of immersion comes from a method called the direct method, which is very easily defined. It's learning a foreign language, using the foreign language as both the means and the goal of study. So I learned the foreign language through the foreign language. And it started as a reaction to a translation method, which was basically the method that for centuries has been used to learn languages. It's based on the tradition of learning Latin and such. And the problem with that is, or the basis of that is that we learn languages as we learn our native languages, which is a very interesting idea, but it's not exactly true. Simply by the mere fact that babies, for example, they don't have a native language. They only have their predisposition to learn languages, whereas us, for example, no matter the age, we already have a language. We already have a filter. That's how it's called, language acquisition. And that makes, of course, language learning automatically not the same as acquiring a native language. So therefore, the strategy has to be kind of different. And the other thing is the fact that as adults, we don't learn in the same way as children. So children tend to learn a lot, let's say through immersion, through abstract, or through memorization, for example. Like that's one of the reasons we know so many songs as kids, to learn stuff like our ABCs. It's basically a song in every language. And that's the reason why when you reach, for example, middle school and onward, you don't have to sing things. I mean, you learn things a little bit more directly, more explicitly. And it's because we tend to learn more through analysis, through rules and stuff, which is also a downfall when you start learning languages, because that's not enough, right? You have two extremes: either you go full grammar or you go full immersion, right? And basically, what I want to bring into a community is that this tendency of going exclusively towards immersion and to seek to master a language exclusively towards immersion, it's not only non-scientific, but it's also, it really doesn't work in the long run. It can get you to a certain level, but it's not enough to master a language. So it's not that it doesn't have any result or any benefit. Like I incorporate immersion both in my language study and also when I teach. I use a direct method. Like I do teach things using the target language. It's also problematic when you go to, for example, try to explain abstract concepts, like how, for example, am I supposed to gesture liberty, the word liberty? How am I going to explain that? Like
with a torch.
Literally, well, if you know the Statue of Liberty, but if you don't, it's another hurdle,
Together later.
Yeah, literally. Like if I were to say like bottle, I could just say bottle, for example. But once you say, for example, I don't know, some abstract word, spirit, for example, how am I supposed to, gesture spirit? So that's one of the shortcomings of the method, and therefore one of the shortcomings. Exactly. It has
He's got spirit.
Yeah, literally. So it's like it has its pros and cons. So I always want to try to bring balance into language learning and not to adopt this very polarized discourse as to how should you learn languages, and to go exclusively immersion. In the same way, I'm against going exclusively for grammar, because none of them are just enough.
Right. And that's one kind of thing that I picked up from reading your tweets, is that you talk about the importance of implicit versus explicit learning. Why don't you explain a little bit what that is and how we can, how that works in language learning?
Yeah. So explicit learning, that's this other extreme of full grammar, for example. This is your typical, again, talking about an extreme case. Going through books, through grammar books, through exercises, through fill in the blanks, through, I don't know, explicitly learning vocabulary, through index cards, for example, through vocabulary exercises and stuff, looking up, for example, the words in readings and stuff. So that's explicit learning. It's when you literally become conscious and you do an activity that slows down the input and you analyze and break it down, right? Explicit learning. That's important for you to understand the structure, right? So there's another tweet where I shared on the difference between a rule-based and I forgot the other base rule, but we basically have two ways of producing language. Either we build our sentences, or we automatically just produce them like chunks. Right? And I don't know if you had the experience of, for example, talking about a subject that's outside your comfort zone, in the sense that it's outside the typical words and vocabulary that you use in your everyday life in Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happens, you need to even talk even slower and like analyze your words and, you know, pick your words and then conjugate the verbs correctly, and you just stick them in. You're not already just producing your sentences. You have to build them a little bit more. And that tends to happen for these not comfort zone topics in language learning, right? So that's why it's important to explicitly learn a language so you can build the sentences as you start to communicate more.
Okay.
But once you do that, you also need to balance that with implicit learning. And there's a lot of benefits to implicit learning that you won't gain through, for example, it's explicit learning. In implicit learning, this is the other extreme, the immersion extreme, where you expose yourself to native content, preferably comprehensible input. So not just native speaker input, or for example, watching the news, which is like the perfect example of C1 or C2 kind of content.
Mm-hmm.
Starting a little bit with more broken down content and simpler content, for example, kids shows or cartoons or even like teen movies. It's basically exposing yourself to content. Why is that important? Because there's a lot of learning that happens implicitly just by listening, for example, or just by being exposed to the content. Especially if you have a musical ear, like there's a correlation between, for example, playing instruments and having a musical ability and language learning, because well, there's a lot in common between perception of pitch versus also perception of phrases and new vocabulary. And it's happened to me a lot in Russian. So it's one of the reasons that I do always suggest to balance those two, because one is not enough without the other.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let's say that you're starting a language, right? Let's say you're starting a language. Are you going to incorporate them from the very beginning, or would you spend some time doing, let's say, implicit, a few months, I don't know, whatever, and then maybe incorporate kind of more of the what is it, the explicit, or are you just doing both from the beginning?
I would suggest both, because like explicit, like when you start with a motivation, you're in that honeymoon stage. Of course, you're not gonna have problems with, you know, just sitting down with a brand fresh new book and, you know, just getting to know these new words and, you know, just learning the grammar structures and such. I mean, you're in that initial motivation, but somehow you also need to complement that with some practical content. So I would typically incorporate both of those at the same time. And the trick is finding resources, like especially when you're starting out and trying to incorporate like native content for that immersion part, but that's also adjusted to your level. Like that's kind of difficult to also find. One of the best ways is to find a good language learning resource, a book or a course that includes that. But you also need to have, you know, like these filters as to what kind of language learning material you should use and how good are they actually made. So but I definitely suggest doing both at the same time, simply because of the fact that when you learn, for example, exclusively through immersion, there's a lot you miss out and a lot of lacunes that can form with time without one knowing, that can be solved by parallelly also tackling, you know, what am I immersing myself to, and what type of structures am I being exposed to, so I can replicate them also. Or in order to, you know, make sure that you don't misunderstand a structure or a use of a word, or I'm trying to remember of a word in Russian. For a long time, I tried to misuse. The difference between следующее и прошедшее, yeah, which is following and previous. I don't know why прошедшее, which is previous, I associated it with well, because of Spanish, with following, because in Spanish it's próximo, right, which starts with a P also. So pрошедше and próximo, I associated them as the same word, because pрошедше, I only gained it through immersion, through exposure. So the word was here, but the meaning wasn't present, or it wasn't accurately matched. And in the scenario, what happened was I matched it to the absolute, you know, opposite of what it meant.
Exactly. That's happened. Like, I think, what's it like, in Russian, orange is like appelsin or something like that, but it has like this word apple, and it just makes you think like it's apple. But I know that apple's yablaka.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, when you do both things at the same time, what you're trying to do is to prevent because in immersion, you're implicitly learning, you're not consciously, you know, acquiring or drilling the language into your brain. So you're just acquiring it. So you don't have control of every single aspect that occurs while you're immersing yourself in the language, which is good for some things. For vocabulary, for example, magically learn vocabulary just by exposing yourself, it's awesome. But then you have that risk always. You always have that risk of learning things, thinking you learned them correctly, but you actually learn them incorrectly because you didn't have a filter, an explicit filter to process that down and make sure you understood it. So it helps with the subtleties when you're exposing yourself, and so
That's what I can definitely can see, because when I started studying Russian, I had this idea that I was going to just kind of do comprehensible input for like a year and a half, and just basically do comprehensible input and listen whatever I could. And I actually kind of even went longer without studying grammar, although that wasn't even my intention. I just got used to not studying grammar, and it became hard for me just to open up the book, and because I had this dry ass book. And well, it's another topic. But now that I'm like, okay, well, I can't put it off anymore. I've been kind of focusing, been making it a more active part of my study, and now I kind of see how far that approach has taken me, for the better and also for the worse. It's quite interesting because it was really an experiment, because you hear comprehensible input, or get your work in, and that's cool. But Russian's quite complex, and today I was just thinking, okay, if I took the same approach with a different kind of language, how would the results vary? But Russian, there's so many details, and like I kind of feel that how can I describe it? Like, through this method that I took, there's some things that like I learned to do naturally in terms of grammar. Then there was some kind of things that kind of were activated with a little bit of focused study that I had already basically kind of learned, but just that became activated. And then the third was I just had no idea like at all anyway, like it just didn't even register. So from now on, like I'm making grammar a regular part of my study. But like I can see why it'd be so useful now, because like, for example, let's say like, for example, in situations where you're supposed to like say like turn kniga into knigu, you kind of have like this kind of feel of when like that case should change. But apparently there's some ways where like the case won't even change, even though that like that same kind of intention is there. And it's like, maybe I'm trying to add that case change to words that don't even take that because of some rule or some kind of reason. So it's kind of interesting, just to go through this whole experience. Like I wouldn't have done it a different way, just because I find it so interesting to have thrown myself in this whole experience. Now studying my next language, of course I would adapt, but it's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think one of the point there is immersion works depending on the language. So, for example, if I were me as a Spanish speaker, immersing myself into Italian would have been much more easier, for example, than your experience with Russian, which I could completely relate, because trust me, I understand, all the difficulties that you come about with Russian, and with other languages which are equally as complicated, right? Maybe not in the grammar, but for example, in writing systems as Chinese, for example, or Japanese and such. And the problem is that exclusive immersion works very well when the language is very similar to yours, because you're basically and the reason it works that way is because you're not exclusively immersing yourself in the language. The reason why it works best or better when the language is very similar to your native language is because
you can rely on your first language, right?
Exactly, and therefore it's not exclusively immersion. You're also simultaneously using your native language knowledge to associate. So you're already not just doing immersion; you're already accompanying it with some other strategy that's benefiting you. So I would say that immersion is simply like a method or simply a strategy, so to say, but it's not a principle. And I think a lot of language learners try to, especially those which are like married to particular methods or a particular way of studying, and don't get me wrong, like there are right ways and wrong ways to study a language, to go about language learning. But I think trying to make a method a principle in language learning is one of the biggest mistakes when language learning. And one of the reasons I always suggest, read a little bit about language learning, like ask other people's experiences, because what you want to learn are the principles for language learning, not simple methods that don't necessarily work for your language, or methods that, even worse, people promote them as, like, I learned 6 languages exclusively by immersing myself in the language, and they don't work for you as well. You know that's not enough, So
Okay. And in your humble opinion, what would those principles be?
So in terms of language learning principles, one of the things that I think every language learner has heard to some extent is, for example, learning vocabulary through context, right?
Okay.
Or with the help of context, right?
Sure.
So I remember, I don't remember which language it was, but I remember I was trying to solve the problem of retaining words or studying vocabulary. And I saw this video on YouTube. I don't know even how I met this YouTube video, but it was this video of a kind of a samurai YouTuber, samurai dressed YouTuber, explaining how to study words through an ancient Japanese strategy of just writing the words on a piece of paper. But the paper was folded in half. So you first write the list of words, then you fold it in half, and then try to recall the words and just lower the paper. So it's with a ruled paper. So you would lower the paper one line at a time, and you would get the answer, and then lower the other one, get the answer. It was basically a fancy way of just memorizing pure drilling words. For me at the time, it was like, oh, I could fold a piece of paper this way and get, wow, I don't need to use index cards. But it was pure drilling, and that didn't help at all to retain the word. You can ask me today, it didn't help at all for obvious reasons. I mean, it's as if you were to memorize a grocery shopping list, for example. You're gonna maybe memorize it or maybe learn it for today, but ask yourself 5 years later, or you're gonna you wrote for, I don't know, the first time you went alone grocery shopping. I mean, it's not gonna work because there's absolutely no connection you're doing. And one of the things that works the best for learning new words is connecting them to any other previous knowledge you have. So that's like a second principle I would also suggest. Basing new knowledge or connecting new knowledge to previous knowledge is the best ways to learn things in general.
And how is that done?
So, for example, the very typical, the first idea that may come to mind are mnemonic devices. Like, for example, there was this meme I saw once in Facebook that was it was like a phrase book for a Spanish phrase, but the pronunciation was written in like gibberish English. It was really smart, very well done, like in terms of the creativeness. But in that case, mnemonic devices, the problem with them is that, for example, if I were to associate, I don't know, a word to another word to another word in my native language, that word, I'm always going to get to that word firstly through that association, and then I get to the meaning. So if I were to use apelsin, for example, and I were to associate with apple, even though it means orange. If I would say, oh, apelsin, okay, apple and sin, I don't know, I'm thinking of an apple that commits sin, but I don't know, for example, using a mnemonic device to learn that apelsin is orange. I got my association to retain the word, but how am I connecting it to the meaning? And what am I doing to connect the word to the meaning and then retaining all that, for example, that pair in my mind? And then every time I want to say apelsin, I'm going to think of an apple sinning in order to say orange. And it's like, that makes speech very slow and very choppy. Yeah. You're always going to start thinking, okay, what was that association for orange? Okay, oh, right, the apple sinning, apelsin. And when you come to think of it, then you've already taken 5 seconds and interrupted your speech while you're rushing waiting for you to continue the sentence. So association, for example, with mnemonic devices isn't necessarily effective. But for example,
I don't like that strategy anyway. I don't. It's like connecting things. Why don't I just like look at the word and just try to remember? Like, I don't know. That's one method of language acquisition I don't like.
Yeah, I tend to compare that strategy with really cheap language learning books, like these phrase books, particularly, that typically show you phrases, translation, and then some kind of pronunciation in your language or association. But one of the best ways is to actually use them in phrases.
Uh,
So one of the good things of language learning textbooks is that they intentionally introduce vocabulary through phases or through topics or through levels. So if you were to actually, for example, learn to order things in a bakery, for example, I would like, and the A level, for example, for as a teaching English as a foreign language, you're not only teaching the conditional there, but you're also teaching, for example, the different foods you can order for in a bakery, or at least in Puerto Rico, you buy everything, or not everything, but you can find anything in a bakery for house stuff. So and you get to learn food vocabulary by using that same structure. I would like, I don't know, a loaf of bread. I would love, I don't know, a jar of jam or stuff like that. So learning vocabulary with a fixed context is one of the best ways, just retain the vocabulary. Another strategy would be using stories or using like small short stories, for example, because there's something about storytelling that helps associate words to not only a context but to an event. Um, and so there've been a lot of words I've learned in Russian simply because I read them in a short story about, I don't know, Piotr visiting Russia, or going an exchange student going to Moscow. And so it's really great when you take new words and associate them to either previous contexts, either to a memory. Basically, the more senses or previous knowledge you connect new words to, the better for your retention. So.
Okay. One thing you talked about before is the intermediate plateau. All right. And you say that you can get to the next step just by using passive exposure. Is that just what do you mean by passive exposure? Only like listening to things casually, or could let's say you have a B2 and you're just now learning from content as TV shows, movies, etc. Is that enough to get you to C1, or does it take more?
No, not at all. When you get to B2, I think what I meant in the tweet is that grammar is not enough. It's not the main focus for reaching a C1 level. So the B2 plateau, just to make sure, right? The B2 plateau is not the plateau you feel going from B1 to B2, but the one you go towards C1 from B2, right? So when you reach that level, and basically every language learner that's crossed that and gone to C1, they're going to notice the pattern that grammar starts going scarce. And it's not the same amount of grammar as you learn, for example, in the A level, especially in the B1 level, where you learn a lot of grammar. Grammar, it's not like you don't know new grammar structures, but there aren't so many structures you actually end up learning compared to vocabulary. Because when you're going to C1, you're basically specializing your vocabulary for many, many, many subjects. And already saying in Russian, I don't know, у меня хорошо, that's not enough. Like, I'm okay or I'm fine. That's not necessarily enough to, as you're saying, for example, мне плохо, or I don't know, for example, using other vocabulary that's a little bit more, or other structures that are a little bit more advanced. So those things come a lot when you intentionally consume content. And not only through passive immersion, but when you actually, how do you say, not participate, I got the German verb perfectly in mind. When you engage with the content, that's the word. Right? So not only just sitting back and just reading or just watching dark or just, listening to podcasts, but doing that, but complementing that with also breaking the content down and studying the vocabulary, studying any new structure that you don't know, and use content, use every native level content that you can find to actually expose yourself to the language so you can get more vocabulary. Studying simply, for example, from grammar books, or even I would say that finding a nice textbook for B2 to C1, one of the difficulties is that you start seeing these grammar explanations less and less, and that's pretty uncomfortable. I mean, when you're accustomed to grabbing a textbook and seeing, not only these stories and these sentence exercises and these vocabulary exercises, but also these very nice grammar explanations, and sometimes at the end of each unit you have a grammar summary, and it's pretty nice, pretty comfortable, pretty similar to how we adults think. and you start seeing that the activities in B2 and C1 textbooks are more discussion, explain, write an essay, explain or defend your point of view. It's like it brings you out of the comfort zone because it's all not just only about grammar. It's about vocabulary. It's about collocations, about knowing how to express very fine, detailed meaning, and being very precise with your language. So I always try to suggest to consume content and also extract the vocabulary and collocations from that, because basically that's how the majority of people get to C1 after all, by engaging with content and not just passively, but actively engaging and consuming and digesting content.
Like maybe watching a series, but stopping when you hear something interesting and noting it down, or when you're reading, maybe.
With series, it might that would be a good idea if you have the stamina for it. Like I would recognize I wouldn't have the stamina, for example, for a 45-minute episode and giving it pause. Like I know Luca Lampiarello, for example, he uses a lot that strategy of taking videos and pausing and studying the vocabulary. He actively engages with that type of content. I would recognize I wouldn't have the stamina for that. So I would basically look for example, articles. One of the good things for German that really helped me for C1 is that German has a lot of resources for language learning, especially this news channel called DW or DW. They basically have a section in their website for everything language learning for German, for every level. And their texts tend to be adjusted for each level. So I used a lot those texts to reprocess, of course, the vocabulary, study them, and of course, any structure I didn't understand to question that. And also with textbooks that are for that level. There are a lot of kind of essays that are in textbooks that also, expose yourself to the vocabulary of that topic or the structures of that topic. And it's pretty much that what tends to get you to C1, to expose yourself, to actively engage with the content and try to expand every structure you've known since B1 and B2 to expand varieties of that. One of the things that I write a lot about C1 is synonyms, for example. So it's not enough to say I'm fine or I don't know, j'ai fait ça très excellent. No, like I did that excellently. You need to define a little more and use synonyms and use different types of words or synonyms to actively explain what you want to say. So
okay, yeah, excellent, thank you. So I was reading something that you had posted. It was a direct study from some language researcher. I thought it was quite interesting to comment on. All right, so qualities of a good language learner, according to research, Rubin, 1975. Willing to make mistakes, willing and accurate guessers, have a strong drive to communicate, take advantage of all practice opportunities, focus on form by looking for patterns and analyzing. Would you add anything else to this list?
Adding to that list, let me see.
Qualities of good language learners.
I would. I think one of the main quality I would add is to balance methods. Honestly, like I think that's one of the things that people need the most. Like nowadays, like I see so much polarization as to full immersion, or no, you gotta use a grammar book, or you gotta study, use a simul and grab a language textbook and you just drill or immerse yourself in that book. And there are like these sides to language learning. And again, don't get me wrong, like there are good ways and wrong ways to going about this. There are things that work and things that don't work in principle. But that doesn't mean that you should only focus on this one method and not incorporate things that also attack, for example, other skills. Like the problem with, for example, exclusively using immersion is that it only cultivates passive skills like listening and reading. And what's wrong with speaking? What's wrong with writing? Right, which are equally as important as other skills, and they actually complement each other in a very interesting way. So when you incorporate different methods for different skills, and according to your levels also, because your methods should change according to your level, right? Like for example, when you're crossing the plateau, it contributes to a richer experience and a higher quality of learning. Like when you want to reach a decent level in a language, you don't want to reach it and know a lot of words with a very, for example, very bad pronunciation, or have an awesome pronunciation with a lot of grammar mistakes, or have a perfect grammar but very few vocabulary. You see, and you have all these areas of language learning which, when you adopt like a full side of one single method, that this is the way that not only works for me but the right method, it doesn't let you to also consider these other elements that make an advanced or proficient learner, well, proficient in their language. So balancing your methods is one of the most important things I would add to that list. So.
Right. And another interesting thing that one that I could add is just kind of analyzing where you are and knowing what you need at that point to achieve what you want to achieve, within a time frame. I've given myself, I have this time frame of 5 years to study Russian before even thinking about another language. And here I am at year 3, and I've studied what I've studied up until this point. But one of my big goals of this year is to actually go to Russia. And let's just say that this would happen in 6 months. And now it's like, okay, well, I'm looking at things in like basically a matter of years. That Russian's a lifetime thing. I'm not really in a rush, but now it's just like, okay, what do I need from the point that I'm at now to get me to my goal, at least a midway goal? And that midway goal would be to go to Russia, to communicate, to use the language to the best of my abilities. Now, what do I need right now to get myself to that point? Okay, I've got a pretty solid foundation. I've got some holes, gaps, of course. Now I need to fill those in. So for me, it would be to stay consistent with grammar study, to stay consistent. Well, basically, I'm incorporating grammar study, and I need to stay consistent with it. Be more consistent with my reading and even up it more. And maybe, possibly, but this one's for me like the most controversial one, is like, make these words that I have floating around my head more active so I can use them at the time that I need to be speaking, right? And, I know Anki is a very famous tool for that, but for me, it's hard for me to get on that train. It's like I'm one of those people that like I just prefer to just be doing language work outside of Anki, because I don't know, it's like too mechanical. But I don't doubt the effectivity of review, because even in high school I would we would get flashcards and we'd have to take these tests, and I would review the cards like crazy, and those were words that I remembered like 12 years later when I actually came to Mexico. And so those are kind of the 3 ways that I see that myself to be where I want to be for that period of time. But so I think knowing where you are and kind of how you need to get there. But this leads into like the whole Anki thing, or let's say repetition thing. I know that you are an Anki user. I mean, can you give me some advice on how to like make things more active in my vocabulary? Do I need? I mean, what do you think about all this?
Yeah, let me say something. Like, first of all, like I am not. I wouldn't say I'm an Anki fan. Like I've spoken about Anki like as a great tool, specifically because of the fact that it doesn't only incorporate space repetition, but also it lets you customize like the index cards, not just the front and back format, but you can add more fields to each of those sides. But it's an ugly tool. Like every time I go in, I reluctantly go in because it's a really ugly tool.
Like I hear people making their cards. For me, that sounds like a freaking nightmare. Like I don't want to be sitting down, like entering cards. Like for me, I can't even imagine that. Like it's almost like I can't even. I'm forsaking the effectivity just because I can't even be bothered to go through such a torture of like entering words. So then it comes to me as like, okay, I'll find it maybe a good deck. And even if I have a good deck, it's still like, okay, well, now I got to be consistent with this, even if it's pre-made.
One of the things I used, I found this software, but it was like these kinds of softwares are like hidden gems in the internet, and they're, for you to install them or to download it, you actually have to be basically a coder or to install them or to get to know how to use them. So I had that experience, and I found a tool that lets me put in text, and it identifies all the words right there. Like, of course, at an initial stage, it treats all the words as unknown words. But with time, it recognizes, okay, you already studied this word, and it doesn't highlight. good thing about that is it lets you click on the word, for example, and automatically opens like in two windows. On the top one, like the index card format,
Mhm.
and on the bottom one, the dictionary to look for the meaning that you want to write into the index card. I use that all this semester because I was taking a B2 plus level course for Russian, and we had to read a lot of articles. And to acquire all that vocabulary and kind of study that and get to actually practice it, because the worst thing is actually making the cards themselves. Studying them is not that much of a problem once you already have them. So I found that tool to actually, while I was reading, every time I had to look up a word, since I already had to stop to look the word up, I had that software to actually click the word. It automatically looked for the word up in the dictionary of my preference, and it created the index card, to actually, put the word in, and you just save it. And I just exported that to Anki and then started to study them. But I know not everyone has the facility to actually install that kind of software, and so really, going down to it, there's some things in language learning that you are just unavoidably, difficult because you're self-learner, right? So typically, when you take for example, a language textbook, like the vocabulary is already there. The glossary, if it's a good textbook, the glossary is supposed to be there, like language learning list. I'm sorry, the vocabulary list. If you buy German textbooks, they're typically good business people, and they include the vocabulary list in a separate book, so you have to buy them. I mean, it's kind of a marketing strategy, but that's one of the things I always advise against. Find a textbook that already has a vocabulary list. But if you learn languages through, for example, a good textbook, it's already there, the vocabulary, the exercises, the vocabulary list, so you don't have to do that. But when you choose alternative methods, then you have to compensate for the fact that you don't have a syllabus prepared for you, and that's part of the sacrifices that, as a self-learner, you gotta be able to pay the cost in that. Like, either you buy something that's already organized for you, or if you want a very custom method, then you gotta take that upon yourself, because if you're not learning with an instructor, then you have to play the role of not only the learner but also the instructor when you're self-learning. And that's one of the main reasons I tell people, like, look up how to learn languages, because at least instructors, like, they studied, or they're supposed to have studied, how to teach languages, right? But we don't all necessarily know how to learn languages in principle. And especially, we don't know necessarily, and we're very sure don't know how to study or how to learn that language in particular, right? One of the principles when you learn Romance languages is that you need to learn the verb to have and to be. Those are the first two verbs that you have to learn. The question is why? Well, because every compound tense uses either always the word have, right, like in Spanish, or in other Romance languages, you have to choose. They have an auxiliary split where you have to either choose to have or to be for every complex tense compound, right? And that's the reason you have to study that. But people don't know that, of course, if they don't study how to actually tackle the language, right? If you're a linguist, of course, no problem. You can just dive in. But I always advise people to look up how to tackle the language, because you actually have to adopt that double role when you're self-learning, be the learner and the instructor. So,
well, that's quite interesting what you said. It's because, like, in the community, we oftentimes get like general advice, but you here mentioning specific advice for specific languages. That's quite interesting, but it makes a lot of sense. You just don't hear a lot of it.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things I do aspire to do is to actually share more tips on specific languages. Like, I was thinking on actually doing kind of a monthly, every week change a language tips on a particular language, because once you survey, for example, a whole family, you get to see these patterns. Like for Italian, for French, and for Portuguese and Spanish don't have that problem, but for these languages that have these auxiliary splits, it's really important you get those two verbs, for example, down at the very beginning. Like, it's kind of ridiculous to even start learning present tense of other verbs and you don't know how to even say I am, right? So it's like one of the most basic phrases to learn a language. And then when you start going and talk about the past, which is, I say, one of the most important tense in any language, to talk about the past, because, well, it's where the majority of our lives exists, right? then you also have to use these auxiliaries, right? In French, you have to always either choose. In German also, right? German, French, and Italian have the same quality. You have to choose either to have spoken or to be gone, for example. That's how you literally say the past tense for the verb to talk and to go in these languages, right?
Right.
And so,
Yeah, it reminded me of, I don't know if you heard about this, but Luca has his kind of famous bidirectional translation method, and he's learned a bunch of languages like that. But he said that when he tried to study Japanese using that same method, it was a failure, and he had to learn basically to adapt.
yeah, literally, like there are some methods that work like universally. There are some that are just language specific, and that's not surprising because, well, languages are different, have different types, different systems. There are principles that cover every language. Like that's one of the amazing things you study in linguistics. Like there are things that are common like for every language. Like the word for mother tends to have an M somewhere, like mama, madre, mother, mère,
Or
madre.
like, at least in European languages, how the no is starts with an N, right?
What starts with an N? Sorry.
Like the word for no, isn't it like no? I don't know. Like even in Russian, it's like niet is that kind of N
Oh,
sound.
okay. Sorry. To know as in negate. Okay, sorry. I thought no asking to know. Like
Oh no,
no, no. Yeah, exactly. That's also pretty interesting, cross linguistically speaking. But then, of course, you have these differences in different language groups and language types, which require different strategies. You don't have to learn verb conjugations for Chinese, for example. So any method that works for highly inflective languages, for example, can't work necessarily for Chinese because it's a different language. Ways to, if you study English, for example, you can't use the same methods for Russian because it has declensions, has grammatical cases, 6 of them, or 7 if you include vocative, for example. But you need to change your methods according to the language you're speaking. And so if you learn Finnish, it's a synthetic language, agglutinative. So you have to literally smush words together and they form these long words that actually translate to an entire sentence. And that requires a different approach. So that's one of the reasons why there are very few methods that apply to every language, so to say. I would say there are more principles which apply to language learning per se instead of methods.
It comes back to the beginning, and it's like, wow, isn't language learning, the process of language learning, language acquisition, such a fascinating thing?
Definitely.
For me, it's just so interesting.
Definitely. And considering all the variables that come into play, all the different skills you need to know, all the different cultural notes, like for example, this typical Balkan cliche or cultural difference where this means no and this means yes. Like I don't know.
Yeah.
So these are cultural things that you don't necessarily get with immersion exclusively or exclusively learning grammar, right? Something that you get with
right? Heard about that. That's got to be funny.
It is. Happens in let me see, in Bulgarian it happens, in Albanian it happens, basically in all the Balkan region.
All right. So one thing that constantly, well, it definitely surprises me. So, for example, I studied a bit of linguistics. I took some classes and stuff, and you could see kind of like the progression of thought, how things evolved. I don't know, from Saussure to Chomsky, and but talking about language learning or within like the general sphere of language learning community, there's only really one person that anybody ever talks about, which is Krashen. And I think why is that? Because like if we're talking about any other field, there's going to be lists of people, there's going to be schools of thoughts. So I'm kind of just like I'm kind of confused how like not more of this has gotten into the language learning sphere online, and I'm very curious to kind of find out language learning beyond Krashen at an academic level. So maybe this is something that you have some experience with that you can talk a bit, maybe some figures, some studies, some research is that could shed light into language learning, maybe for us to read upon, to learn more about, or just have it general introduction of
Yeah.
people that have contributed to this language learning acquisition thing that's not crashing, because he can't be the only one, and like that just be, I just can't believe that could be the case, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think he just got lucky into getting sympathy from a few very, I don't know, influential users on Twitter. And that's why you get to hear from him a lot.
YouTube in general.
Yeah. The reason why you don't hear much from other linguists, for example, instead of, for example, with Chomsky, Saussure, for example, and then you have Krashen, because Krashen is from language didactic, so language learning, and then you have Chomsky and Saussure, which are just general
Just
linguistics.
linguistics.
Yeah. And typically, no one gets them that level of exposure, and so typically we don't focus on just one person. We focus on the principles or the research right topic. The reason why he got very popular, I would say, is because of this whole it went in favor of that movement pro immersion, right? And it's also pretty comfortable as a concept to say, well, let's just consume content to learn a language. And well, it's a pretty chilled approach if you kind of think of it. And it does have its benefits. But other things that are proven in research is like spaced repetition, the power of association, like connectivism, for example. Connectivism is a principle of neuroscience where you learn better through connections, and your brain doesn't, chunk knowledge into areas, but it's all interconnected. One of the principles for studying bilinguals, for example, bilingual speakers, is that they don't have two systems of language, but one system of interconnected codes. That explains a lot of, for example, in code switching, why it's so easy for native bilinguals to code switch, because it's just one system, right?
They don't go from one language to the other, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's there are patterns. I mean, it's not like, for example, in Spanish, I would say el dog, for example, like no, literally, like it's been studied, like no native bilingual would say that, like in that, it would just break away or just switch codes within one clause or one phrase, right? So it always happens across phrases, like the dog fue al supermarket, for example, or el perro fue to the supermarket. Code switching, right, in these very fixed places. But that comes from connectivism, and at the same time applies to language learning. One of the things I always encourage people is to learn things through multi-sensory input. So, for example, if you have one of the reasons why immersion, while active engaging with the content, as I mentioned, works really well, is because you have a visual stimulus, you have an auditory stimulus, you have a textual stimulus, right? And above that, you're not just having multiple of those stimulus happening across every second. You're slowing things down, you're actually processing it. And since you're actually digesting the content with multiple sensory information, it helps you connect it better. Remember that the problem with mnemonic devices, that you have that between the device and the meaning? Well, when you learn languages with multisensory information, it tends to foster a faster acquisition, because there's more information for your brain to connect it to. And you also have the event. Like if it's a content that speaks to you and you're actively, you enjoy, you also have that passion part, and you tend to remember things you'll really like. I mean, who remembers stuff from their worst or most hated class in college? Nobody, right? Because you lack that connection to it. But when you're actively engaging with, for example, content that you really love, you tend to remember it better, not only because of that multisensory information, but you also have that memory, right? You have the emotional connection. And the more connections you have to something, the better and the faster you're going to acquire it. So,
for sure. I mean, it's funny just living abroad and being able to use Spanish. There's been so many times where in certain kind of emotional moments of my life, I said something like in important moments, and it was a mistake, and maybe I even knew it once it came out, but I never forgot like that ever again. You know what I mean? I always knew that, okay,
yeah,
because like I had that, like it was in a moment of like, emotion of one sort or the other.
Yeah, I think it was yesterday. That was one of the reasons I tweeted about what's your most embarrassing language learning experience, because it's really, I mean, one of the characteristics in you read that list on the qualities of a good language learner is actually the disposition to actually make mistakes, right? So when you have these embarrassing experiences, they're so valuable because for the first, they make great jokes. And the second of all is that you actually learn something at the moment permanently. Like I never ever forget to actually say da every time I want to say yes in Russian, simply because of that first time I said with such a firmness in my mind, we in the middle of a classroom. By the way, I was a freshman, so everyone was older than me. So I was like the outsider, the youngest one in the class, and just said we in a Russian class. So and those things are
Yeah.
really valuable. So.
All right, so we're going to take it to the questions. So if any of you guys have some questions, please write in the chat. We'll go to this one. What advice do you have for people trying to start learning Russian? Very relevant topic.
Definitely. Start with the alphabet and learn how to write in cursive. That's one of the first things. A lot of people don't know how to write in cursive. And one of the things that you culturally meet when you go to Russia, for example, or see Russian writing, for example, it's not that Russians all write like in cursive, but when you start writing in the block alphabet, I mean, that's one of the signs that first, you're a foreigner, and it doesn't give a good cultural impression in terms of education, in terms of you actually taking the time to get to know the language. And it's a really simple thing that a lot of people, like overlook. And it actually makes language learning a little bit more easier with Russian because when you take notes, for example, actively like write your words in Russian, you also have that motor information, right, from multisensory information helping you along the way for the rest of your Russian learning journey. So first of all, learn the alphabet. I mean, it's a different alphabet. Without learning that, you're not going to be able to immerse into Russian. That's the first thing. And the second thing is to make sure you understand how the pronunciation works. Like one of the difficult things in Russian is pronunciation, both because every consonant has two ways of being pronounced. Vowels are also reduced, so you have the word milk, for example, moloko. That's how it's written, moloko, and it's pronounced malako. Yeah, and it's not how it's written. So get the pronunciation straight. Learn the alphabet from the start, the very start, not exclusively without just touching upon a little bit of the language, but actually spend some time with the alphabet, and make sure you have a good language learning resource. Like I can't stress how important it is to actually have like a base curriculum. Because there are a lot of things to tackle in Russian. It's a lot. It's a very complicated language, especially for English speakers. So being a starter in Russian and not knowing how to tackle it, and above that, trying to self-learn it without actually having at least some kind of curriculum, it's pretty difficult and frustrating. So if you have a really good textbook, some kind of learning resource that can at least organize the content for you, that's one of the best things I could suggest for starting out with Russian. And of course, when you get to cases, to your first grammatical cases, do not go to the next case or to new material until you master that case, because you're going to create lacunes and you're going to add more cases and you're start going to mix endings. It's going to get really complicated. So just make sure you learn things, new content, get it down before moving to the next with Russian, especially with Russian. So
excellent. Where do you see another script in reading and learning another language? I have a block above it.
Let me see if I can understand the question. Where do you see learning another script? Learning. Oh, okay. In what? I think it means that in what part of the progress or the journey, right? Learning the script, I would say from the very start. Like I do not imagine how can people learn a script later in language learning? Like I cannot imagine going about Japanese without learning the different writing systems. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but you're gonna reach a roadblock sooner or later, because I mean, you can't just expect first a language that's written in a different script to always be adapted to you in your Romanji, for example, right? In the Latinized version of Japanese. You're going to reach a roadblock. And especially when you look for language learning resources, the quality of language learning resources that adapt a foreign script into your script is surprisingly very low. Like, for example, if you were to take Latinized Russian content, the quality is really bad. Like, it tends to have a lot of errors or mistakes. And you simply don't get, that's not really immersing yourself or learning the language per se. Like, the writing system is so important. It's another source of information to retain the words. It's another source of information for you to write and to express yourself, right? A part of the writing skill. And it simply makes it easier. I mean, I know it's very difficult at the start. It hurts the eyes at the start, but trust me, it's so worth it. It just takes a load off your chest afterwards when you continue to a little bit more advanced material. So learn reading in the script right from the start, especially the script. Writing comes with time, learning the pronunciation and practicing the script. Learn the script from the very start as soon as possible.
Okay. And what was the name of the software that you mentioned when we were talking about Anki?
I don't remember exactly the name. Let me see if I have the name here. It was Learn with Text, I think. The name of the software. Yeah, Learn with Text. It's basically the same principle that's used with the link queue, I think. Doesn't have all the features, but it's still the same principle of using text, searching on a dictionary, creating the index cards. It's an open source software, so it's free. And the only problem is it's really hard to install. It's not like a set program that you just hit install and that's it. I wish, but no, it's a little bit more complicated. But at least the instructions are on the website, and you can just look it up. So.
On the language acquisition research side, the ones I find most interesting today are Christensen's chunking model and Judith Kroll's idea of regulating the native tongue. Have you heard of these ideas?
I heard the first one, not the second one. I'm definitely looking into that. I can imagine what it should be about. But yes, the first one is actually a really good principle on chunking. I know that he uses it to actually teach language learning and apply it to everyone. Like, it's the extreme of adopting one method for everything, right? Again, with the same problem. But the principle behind that is really useful. Because when you learn, as I said with the example with this funny samurai style, language learning or vocabulary learning, just learning lists of words is so inefficient. I mean, I cannot stress it enough. It was such a frustration afterwards because I said I spent 2 hours studying a vocab list and I don't remember anything. The other day, I also saw a pic in Twitter. This learner and she had beautiful handwriting. She was practicing vocabulary by writing 20 times or 10 times each word, and I felt the pain. I said, "Why are you investing so much time in just repeating the word? I mean, that's not going to get you much farther than just remember it for this week. Once you get to next week, you're going to forget them." So the chunking method of actually learning things through chunks or through fixed phrases, dialogues are really fun for that. It's a really good principle. Not always possible, but if you can do that as much as possible, I definitely suggest it. So.
Okay. On the learning method side, my personal favorite is Paul Nation's 4-strand model.
The 4-strand model. Let me look. Do you think there's variation in what the most effective method would be according to what the learner's individual goals are? Okay, so the level of variation between individual goals and methods, like, there are two very separate things. And it all depends on, for example, the type of goal you have. So let me say, for instance, someone who wants to live in a country versus someone who just wants to consume culture or content in that language. I wouldn't see those two as separate things, or at least involve having a repercussion onto what you need to learn for that. Because if you want to live in the country, well, consuming cultural content is part of it, for example. And for you to consume cultural content, you also need, to some extent, a high level of proficiency, right? So when mastering a language, I mean, the recipe or the building blocks to reaching proficiency are going to be the same. Like, for example, in my case, reaching a C1, for example, I'm basically going to have almost the same qualities or the same capabilities as anyone else who reaches C1, simply because of the fact that the steps required to reach C1 are the same, despite the individual goals I may have. Now that may cause, for example, to learn, I might learn more specialized vocabulary, for example, in linguistics, but that's something that's more regarding what I learn in terms of vocabulary more than the methods I use for achieving a goal. The language learning skills are still the same: speaking, hearing, writing, and reading. You still have got to, I mean, those are still the four skills that no matter your goal, you're going to still have to tackle. And for each of those skills, and according to your level, there are some methods for each of them. So I wouldn't say they would change according to individual goals.
Right. Do you think it's helpful to watch Russian cartoons, easier children's content when starting to learn Russian?
I started that way. I started watching Soviet cartoons, Soviet propaganda for children, or very short commercials when starting out with Russian. It's really fun, especially if you're like a history nerd or you just love Russia's history. I started with that, and somehow like cartoons also. I'm not saying that it's always easy, because sometimes like you can be surprised how complex children's content could be, like for especially short stories. Like if you read
like these folk tales, right?
Like folk tales, for example, I tried to read folk tales. I couldn't bear the first or second pages, because folk tales have these very poetic words, and sometimes these very folk like phrases or выражения, expressions for I don't know, like in Spanish we say matar dos pájaros de un tiro, like to kill two birds with one.
Idiomatic expressions.
And yeah, exactly. So that could be a kind of challenging, but it's definitely fun. And I would say definitely, especially for a beginner level, as long as you can tolerate the vocabulary. Like Luca Lamparello has like he's just, for example, having 70, at least 70 to 60 to 70% comprehension to make something comprehensible input, which I would agree with him, because otherwise, if you just understand like 50% of the content, that's going to be too much to digest in one sitting, even for 1 week. So.
Right. So even like say for reading, you'd say that 60% comprehension is all right to kind of work your way through it.
If I'm going to be honest, I would increase that a little bit more, because once again, when you're a self-learner, you got to also work with your own motivation, and maybe 30% is a little bit too much. Even this semester, reading all these articles, I typically had a 10% non-comprehension. So 10% of the words I didn't know, or they were new to me, which might seem little, but when you're actually reading the article in a foreign script, a foreign language per se, but above that foreign script, it gets really exhausting. And even that 10% vocabulary that you don't know, you start noticing it. So according to the difficulty of the language, I would raise that to maybe like 70 plus. And the more difficult the language, a little bit more the percentage of comprehension I would suggest. So.
So I noticed that I guess you were not so much a big fan of Google Translate in language learning, but I'm going to tell you a way that I've used it, that I actually am using it, and you can tell me if you think that's not so effective, if it's fine, and if not, then what would you recommend? All right. So in the book that I'm reading now, I'm using Google Translate for when I don't understand anything. When I don't understand something, so I'll put it in Google Translate, see what it is, and then I'll kind of just like I'll write the word down and kind of maybe write the definition or whatever, and then just keep it going. And so what I'm trying to say is I'm using it as a way to make my reading more comprehensible. In this situation, is Google Translate fine, or would you still not recommend it in the way that I'm using it right now?
For the sake of every translator out there, I would definitely go against everything Google Translate related. The only pro or good thing I would say from Google Translate is the text-to-speech algorithm, like to learn pronunciation. If there is absolutely no other resource out there and Google Translate is the only one, for example, there is a plugin for Anki that converts text into speech. And I use that, for example, to have more multi-sensory information to when I learn vocabulary. For Polish, for example, there's only the Google version voice. So I've used it because it's just pure pronunciation. But if you want, is the book in Spanish in this case?
Russian.
Russian. Okay, so there are a lot of dictionaries, like bilingual dictionaries. I don't know if you know Lingvo, like Lingvo. It's a really good bilingual dictionary.
Mm-mm.
There's Pons, which is originally German, but they have for a lot of languages, Pons. They also have a good bilingual dictionary. I don't know if you know this other translator, Reverso. That's another good website. It's basically a translator, but it lets you see excerpts of text, so you can see if the translation is for the context or the intention you mean, right, for that word,
Mm.
right? Um, because the problem with Google Translate is that you don't get a feel of what meaning a word can have multiple meanings and therefore multiple translations, right? So you have sini and goluboy. Google Translate's going to tell you it's blue, right? But sini
I'll
and
oftentimes put in a chunk, like not just an individual word, but just like a chunk of language, and it's typically enough for me to understand what I'm reading.
Mhm. Yeah, I would still suggest you to use at least bilingual dictionaries in order for you to also discover like the other meanings. So you don't have to look for that word again if it's in another meaning. Um, and also because it tends to be more accurate. Like it's if you kind of think of it, Google dictionaries were made by like speakers of the language, whereas Google Translate is actually made by an algorithm that searches text and shows you the most accurate one according to it. But it's still machine learning and it's a very young field. So in order just to make sure that you get always the right meaning without having to worry about the translation, I would always suggest just go by bilingual dictionary. Mm.
All right. How many languages do you recommend learning at once? Can you effectively?
And can you effectively? That's really individual specific. How many languages do you recommend learning at once, or can you learn at
Maybe
once?
maybe it's the question is, can you effectively learn at once?
Can you? Okay, so let me give you my experience. There was this point in my bachelor's where I was learning three languages at once. Like I was taking three foreign language courses at once, and casually I was also taking a Spanish course and an English course, or a course in Spanish and a course in English. It was the worst semester in terms of because I had five languages in my day-to-day life. Um, in terms of effectiveness, that's really individual specific, I would say. I would never go above three at the same time, especially if you want to get serious about it. I mean, there's one thing is to have one or two serious languages and maybe 15 dabbling ones. Another thing is to learn five languages seriously. I mean, you got to take a pause for yourself, man. I mean, for your own brain, especially, it's for your mental health. And above all, what are you actually, the quality of what you're learning is obviously going to be affected because of the number of languages. Learning two languages at once, you can absolutely do that. Going three languages at once, and also that depends on the level because very few people start to learn three languages from zero at the same time. So it also depends on how high each language is in terms of levels. Um, so yeah, it's pretty individual. It depends on a lot of factors, but I wouldn't go above three if I had to oversimplify the answer.
So in some languages, I think this will be my last question, but in some languages, for example, like Spanish and Japanese, from what I understand, that the phonetic usage is quite low versus some other languages, like for example, English or Russian. What would you recommend for someone who has a native language of Spanish or Japanese that has kind of fewer things to work with, and they have to kind of mold into the speaker of new sounds? How can they kind of make that transition smoother, or to be able to build those skills?
So you mean when your native language has fewer sounds than your target language?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Um, that's where I remember I tweeted this week or last week about learning phonetics. I see that honestly indispensable when you learn languages if you want to have a good pronunciation. Like I honestly can't see, and especially when you're self-learning. Again, when you're taking classes, it's not a problem because the instructor is going to correct your pronunciation, tell you how to pronounce things. When you're self-learning, again, you got to take the role of the instructor and the learner. So learning phonetics, learning the famous phonetic alphabet, the International Phonetic Alphabet for your target language, right? Not every single symbol available. is, I would say, indispensable for learning pronunciation, because I mean, I would love for people to discover it more, that it's basically following a recipe when you when you make a new sound. If you just want to pronounce, for example, um, the vowel "ui" in Russian, for example, when you look the phonetics, it's the position is between the I and the U. For example, in Spanish, the Spanish "i" and the Spanish "u." So right in between, you place your tongue there, you stretch your lips to the sideways or not around them, and you have "u." It's pretty much following a recipe. If you want to pronounce the letter R in Spanish, for example, you have that same phoneme partially in English in terms of the thrill. When you say, for example, I'm ready, the D in ready, right? Or, for example, there are other cases. In English, you have these short thrills, for example, especially it happens with T's and D's. Computer, for example, computer. I don't say computer or computer, computer, right? You use a thrill, and that if you just extend it and repeat that, or try to maintain it for a longer period of time, you get the Spanish R, the r, right? But that only comes when you actually know, right, a little bit of phonetics. So just dabble into phonetics as if you were dabbling into any other language, and find out how to pronounce these new sounds as a recipe. Right? Follow the steps, and after you know how to pronounce the sound in isolation, incorporate words into incorporate that sound into new words, into the words you need them, and then phrases, and then try tongue twisters, which is a great way also.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for this fantastic interview, and thank you for your time. Before we go, what parting words would you have to the audience concerning language learning?
Language learning, don't be so polarized with just one method. The best way to learn languages is to balance your methods. There are right ways and wrong ways to go about language learning. The most important part is to actually do a little bit of not full research, but to get to know what are the different methods out there, how efficient they are, and just look for sound principles. Things that don't have sound principles are things that you shouldn't invest in. They're going to waste your time and your efforts and energy and motivation for language learning. I don't want you to just get drained out or get burnout. So yeah, just choose sound methods, and above all, just balance everything out so you can be a very proficient learner.
All right, thank you, Marco, and we'll see you guys next time, and stay on your come up.
Thank you.